cultural Marxism. Independently, two Marxist theorists, George Lucas of Hungary and Antonio Gramsci of Italy, came up with the same solutions and are credited with being the fathers of Western version of Marxism. It's called cultural Marxism. They both taught that communism was impossible in the West until both Western civilization and Christianity were destroyed, since they blinded the working class to its true Marxist intents. George Lucas recognized the great obstacle to the creation of a Marxist regime was Western civilization itself. He said, "I can see revolution and destruction of society as the only solution for a worldwide overturning of values. This cannot take place without the annihilation of the old values and the creation of new ones." So there in a nutshell, we have the agenda of cultural Marxism explained by one of its creators, George Lucas. Antonio Gramsci, the other creator of cultural Marxism, argued that the West would have to be de-Christianized by means of what he entitled the long march to the institutions. What he meant by this was that the culture must be the new battleground, and that all the barriers to the acceptance of Marxism must be removed or reconfigured according to Marxist principles. All cultural barriers to accept Marxism should be reconfigured starting with the family, i.e., perverting gender roles, removing the rule of the father, going through the churches, the arts, cinema, theater, literature, science, history, entertainment, schools, colleges, universities, seminaries, civic organizations, the organs of mass media, newspapers, magazines, radio, television, and so forth. In institutions of so-called higher education, cultural Marxism was more commonly known as multiculturalism and more loosely known as political correctness. And this is where we are. The Frankfurt School also adopted techniques of psychological conditioning. Today, for example, if the foot soldiers want to do something like normalize transsexuality, they don't argue the point philosophically. They just make Bruce Jenner into a woman, next, and put him on the cover of Vanity Fair magazine and call you a racist if you don't agree. Woman of the Year. To note that the Frankfurt School the men that created the Frankfurt School spent the war years in Hollywood. If you think Hollywood is not totally corrupt, think again. So what basically happened? How did we go from a Marxist theory in Germany, in Europe, to what we've got today, which is a nation of emasculated, effeminate men? So what happened? Basically, we've forgotten or have been demoralized to such an extent that we've forgotten who we are. Our common principles, even the things as basic as what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman, are completely lost. That's how perverted we've become. That's how demoralized we've become through this ideological subversion that most of us don't even know what's going on. And there's a lot of people that support this and love this shit. The cultural Marxist plan to encourage the breakdown of the family, since fatherless boys are extremely affected by the degenerate culture. There's no question about it, and I'll show you more. One of the main ideas of the Frankfurt School was to exploit Freud's idea of pansexualism, the search for pleasure, the exploitation of the differences between the sexes, the overthrowing of traditional relationships between men and women. To further their aims, they would attack the authority of the father, deny the specific roles of father and mother, wrest away from the families their right as primary educators of their children, abolish differences in education of boys and girls, abolish all forms of male dominance, hence the presence of women in the armed forces, declare women to be an oppressed class and men to be oppressors. George Lucas, we mentioned before, played an important role in the founding of the Frankfurt School in Germany. The school was founded in 1923 with a primary goal of translating Marxism from economic terms and political terms into cultural terms. The Frankfurt School may have turned out to be a little more than a historical oddity had Hitler not come to power in 1933. Given that every member was not only a Marxist but also Jewish, they fled Germany with the help of Columbia University. The school reestablished itself in New York City, at which point they shifted their focus from destroying traditional Western culture in Germany to destroying it in the United States. They believe there are two kinds of revolutions, political and cultural. They kept their focus on the Cultural Revolution. One of its members comments, "One can rightly speak of a cultural revolution, since the protest is directed towards the whole cultural establishment, including the morality of existing society. There is one thing we can say with complete assurance. The traditional idea of revolution, the traditional strategy of revolution, has ended. The ideas are old-fashioned. What we must undertake is a type of diffuse and disparate disintegration of the system." With reference to the system, meaning patriarchy, church, patriotism, country, and paternity, father and family, all derived from the root word pater, meaning pattern, meaning father. If you want to destroy a culture, you take out the father, the pater, its root pattern. They also recognized that the working class in America was not going to lead a Marxist revolution because it was becoming a part of the middle class. America was doing great. We had no beef, nobody. Becoming a part of the middle class or the bourgeoisie, the great middle class in America. Who then would lead a revolution in the 1950s? Herbert Marcuse answers, "The coalition will be made up of blacks, students, feminist women, and homosexuals." So, ideological subversion, a great brainwashing. This is a KGB defector by the name of Yuri Benzanov. He's one of the world's outstanding experts on the subject of Soviet propaganda and disinformation and active measures. In 1984, he gave this interview where he states, "Ideological subversion is the slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare." What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interest of defending themselves, their families, their community, or their country. It is a great brainwashing process which goes very slow and is divided into 4 basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 30 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years required to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy. In other words, Marxism, Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students. From another interview, he expands on demoralization, because this is key. We're totally in this demoralized state. This is the process which can take about 15 to 30 years to perform. During this stage, the moral fiber and integrity of the country is put into question, thereby creating doubts in the minds of the people. To do so, manipulation of the media and academia is required to influence young people. As the younger generation embraces new values, such as Marxism and Leninism, the older generation slowly loses control simply through attrition. Again, true facts no longer matter during this stage, but rather creating perceptions are paramount. He continues, without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism, the demoralization process in the United States is basically completed already for 25 years. And this was 1983. Actually, it's overfulfilled because demoralization now reaches such areas where previously not all the experts would have dreamed of. It's been such a tremendous success because most of it's done by Americans to Americans thanks to a lack of moral standards, as I mentioned before. Exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who is demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I show him information with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camps, he will refuse to believe it until he receives a kick in his fat bottom, when a military boot crushes his balls. Then he will understand, but not before. That is the tragic situation of demoralization.